Welcome to the Athletic FC podcast with me, Akinwolere. Newcastle United Saudi owners are set to pull their funding of LIV Golf, while uncertainty is also rife at St James's Park. With our ownership in town for talks, could they lose interest in Newcastle? All right, joining us for this one on The Athletic, we have our Newcastle United correspondent, Waugh. We've also got business of football writer, Matt Slater, with us as well. All right, Newcastle sit 14th in the Premier League. They've lost their last 5 in all competitions and are currently 16 points off Aston Villa, who are in 5th. So, Chris, a good time for Eddie Howe's Saudi Arabian bosses to come into town then?
Well, probably not from Eddie Howe's point of view. That's it sort of stage. If you're going to be, if you just take those statistics and look at Newcastle's travails so far in 2026, certainly in the Premier League, they just seem to be regressing and continuing to regress. It's 9 defeats in the last 12 in the league. But this meeting should not be conflated as some idea as if it's something that's just come about, that's been pulled together all about Eddie Howe's future. That's not the case. Newcastle do these annual off-sighting, as they refer to them, every year. They've done them, and Matt Van Hall, as this one is in Northumberland. Previously, they've done it at Castle. That was on the Amazon Prime documentary in 2023. But Eddie Howe's future will be one of the points of discussion because he is usually there, usually presents. He present on what he thinks has gone wrong this season, why he thinks it's gone wrong, why he thinks he's the right man to change things, and how he believes that things can progress moving forward with him still at the helm, certainly when it comes to transfers and the like going into this summer. So it is good for Howe that he has the chance to sit in front of the ownership and explain that, but not great in terms of you just look at the actual statistics and what he can point to in that regard, because this is very much the toughest time of his Newcastle United tenure so far. Yeah,
people forget this is the kind of stuff managers have to do, except for as well as actually trying to coach their teams, Matt. But, this is an annual meeting. But I think what's fascinating about this, and I said it at the top, is the timing of this, especially with PIF set to pull out of their other sporting project, LIV Golf, as well. Could this have an impact on what they do with Newcastle?
Well, look, I mean, this is the big topic of conversation for the last few weeks, isn't it? I mean, we're recording this Thursday lunchtime. And I think we could get confirmation anytime now of something that we have been reporting. We and other outlets have been reporting for a few weeks, and that is that the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund (PIF) is out in terms of golf. They massively invested in that project around the same time that they bought Newcastle. It was 2021. Huge play, really trying to disrupt, almost buy a global sport, set up this rival league, take on the PGA. They've spent $5 billion on it. I mean, huge investment, nearly all of that on players. So there are kind of very clear football analogies there. And it hasn't worked. I think it'll be studied by business schools for years to come as a kind of wonderful example of disruption stroke hubris. But we're not going to talk about golf. So that has happened. At the same time, or similar timescale, we've seen lots of signs over the last couple of years that Saudi Arabia is starting to reconsider the huge external bets they were placing on sport, entertainment, some straightforward investments in overseas companies. And this is all tied to Vision 2030. So this is the big strategic plan that the Crown Prince MBS has to develop Saudi Arabia, to move away from oil and gas. It's a big country, Saudi Arabia. It's a very young country. It has been a one-trick pony for most of its history. And it has to diversify its economy. So look, these are things we've discussed in the past. People often talk about sports washing, which is fine. Everyone can have their own opinions on sports washing. I always think that we are underestimating if we only focus on sports washing, and there are clear issues about Saudi Arabia, human rights, etc., etc. But if we only concentrate on that, we do, I think, ignore the real internal issues that anyone who is running Saudi Arabia has to grapple with. And that is, you must diversify your economy. You must find work for your people. So Vision 2030 is all about that. The sports stuff has been wrapped up in that, definitely has. It's been about growing tourism. It's about attracting people, encouraging people to stay in Saudi Arabia, making Saudi Arabia just more attractive to external investment. Where does Newcastle sit in that? Well, that is the great imponderable. It's always been a bit unclear. Is it just another kind of flag out there, another investment, another strategic investment? Is it sports washing? Is it a learning exercise? To sort of grow their own football league? Is it a little bit of all of that? We shall see. What we do know is they are making a strategic shift. We're going to stop investing so much outside. We're going to invest more internally. I think because the Saudi economy, even coming into the Iran war, there's been issues. Some of the projects that they've had around these huge giga projects to build cities in the desert, to massively increase the size of everything, haven't really worked, or they're massively over budget. So it's a reassessment of the Saudi project in almost every way. So where do Newcastle, this small investment for them in terms of priority, but also terms in sort of financial amount, where does it sit in this big, complicated picture?
Any words from them, Chris, from where you're sitting, as to where Newcastle sits in their sort of list of investment portfolio?
Well, in this latest sort of restructuring or vision that they've got moving forward, Newcastle fit into strategic is the part that there's three different parts they describe as Newcastle being in the strategic part, and that basically, yes, it's monetary value wise one of the lower investments. Newcastle aren't worth anywhere near as much as many of the companies are. They argue that they have an overinflated importance relative to that, profile wise, being in the Premier League. And the like, and all the assurances subsequently after all of the speculation about LIV over the course of the last few weeks was that the assurances are that they are still intending to keep Newcastle, that they still see growth for the investment, and that people at Newcastle say the same, and that they believe what they're being told. Now, all of that has to be taken with a pinch of salt, because decisions can just happen, and these things could change and move forward. And this is not actually coming directly from officials at PIF. You have to speak to people in and around PIF, because it's very difficult to get to. It's a very difficult organisation to get to the very heart, certainly the decision makers at the top. But the idea is that, Newcastle are separate, they're different, they will continue as they are. And I also think the slight difference with Newcastle is, rather than LIV, you could pull out just financing it. I think with Newcastle, they would probably want to see a return on some of the money they've got. So maybe that they decide to sell at some stage, but you would have thought they're not just going to allow someone to just take it off their hands for very little money. They're spent more than 300 million buying the club. It's more than 800 million now all in. So you'd expect they'd want something like that before they were to move out. And they still see that potentially growing in value over the course of the next few years, and then them getting even greater return on their money. But yeah, for Newcastle fans, I think for them, what they want to see is there's been progress on the pitch up until this season, but off it, they would like to see a lot more development. And that's when they'll really start to believe that the platitudes you get from those in and around PIF that they are committed actually are. That will give them affirmation of that, I suppose.
Yeah, Matt, I mean, none of us are billionaires, and none of us have a wealth fund that stems as far off as, the Saudi Arabian one. But I do look at other sports they're sort of stepping away from, and we've spoken about this before. Perhaps boxing, Saudi Pro League is also in contention, snooker. You talked about the women's tennis in many respects. But football, especially the Premier League, is fascinating for me, because all the other things we've spoken about, I guess they've had to sort of create from the ground up in many respects, whereas they're buying into Newcastle and the Premier League, which is already pre-existing, and it's an echo chamber of its own. Is it easier just to say, actually, we just stick with Newcastle and see how much money we can put into that and forget all the other ones, because they require so much more because we're starting them from the ground up?
Yeah, look, maybe. I think there are a few ways to think about this. I mean, LIV Golf is just the most remarkable story on its own. This attempt to shake up a pretty well-established global sport that is particularly strong in the States. That's the home of golf. It's where the most golfers are. It's where the most tournaments are. It's where the most money is, broadcast money, ticketing money, etc., etc. And to sort of aggressively go after that sport, and just to sort of put in context the LIV investment versus the Newcastle United investment, for example, PIF have invested as much in John Rahm and Bryson DeChambeau as they have in Newcastle United. And one of the reasons the LIV situation has come to a head, there are several, is that Bryson DeChambeau, particularly him, his contract's up for renewal. They just lost a couple of golfers in Brooks Koepka and Patrick Reed. The losses just are staggering, sort of on an annual basis. DeChambeau has so much leverage over them. He'd almost want, I don't know, $500 million to stay. So that decision, it gets crystallised pretty fast. What are we doing? Newcastle is different for a lot of reasons. One, Saudi Arabians care about football. They love football. They don't really. I've been to a golf tournament in Saudi Arabia. There was no one there apart from expats wandering around. No Saudis were there. So they care about football. Two, they got Newcastle United for a great price from just a purely investment. If it was like the sovereign wealth fund buying stocks and shares, they bought low. Mike Ashley was fed up. He was tired. Maybe he thought he was going to have a wonderful, beautiful relationship with PIF going forward. I don't know. But he sold for a pretty good price for the buyer, £305 million. And he sold Newcastle. Yes, they weren't doing very well on the pitch, but they've been washing its own face for years. He hadn't put money in since about the first year of his ownership. So unlike so many football clubs that are sold, it wasn't a distressed asset. I mean, it was distressing people, but the actual club itself was ticking over. And there was loads of kind of obvious upside. A little bit of love and attention could make this thing worth more pretty fast. So it was a very, very good investment. Newcastle's famously a one-club city, big fan base. They're in the Premier League. It had lots going for it. So big difference from LIV. Big. I think you could get into debates about, okay, they're pulling away from snooker at the moment. Again, a cheap sport. Everyone's, had this sort of fascination with the golf. All sports have. But, Saudis don't care about snooker. They've been hosting the WTA, the Women's Tour finals. Again, part of this bigger project to kind of make Saudi Arabian tourism, make it some more of an attractive place. But it hasn't really moved the needle in Saudi Arabia. I don't know if any more people are playing tennis. But I keep coming back to it. People care about football. The issue is, does PIF, the Sovereign Wealth Fund, do the Saudi state care about football in Newcastle or care about football in Saudi Arabia? That's the issue for Newcastle right now. Where does Newcastle United sit in this portfolio? It's not a flashing light at all. I don't think flashes much. I don't think PIF think that much about Newcastle, I'm afraid to say, because it's been a pretty steady, pretty good investment. They're in no hurry to do anything, and I think that would be. I think we're going to get into some of that. That would be my overriding assessment of the last. What is it now? Coming up for 5 years. They've achieved plenty because Newcastle was so ready for some attention, and they put money in. They have put money in. It's best part of 500 million. Most of that on players, nearly all of it on players. And there were, 3 windows in a row of big £100 million net spends. So they've only had one summer 24, where they got into PSR issue, and it was the infamous summer where they had to sell Elliot Anderson. Apart from that, it has been net spends. So their wage bill's gone up. Yeah, they've doubled the revenue. They've doubled the revenue. They've made the Champions League twice. They've won a trophy, first major trophy for 70 years. They've achieved plenty. Have they achieved as much as Newcastle United fans hoped in 21? As many of us sort of wondered, oh, right, is this the next Man City? No. But, expectation, reality, they have achieved stuff. It just maybe isn't as much as many people expected.
Let's talk about the finances then, shall we, Chris? Sorry to bring it up again, but, yes, there has been Champions League qualifications and also a League Cup win, but this season really hasn't gone to plan. Is there pressure on Adey, Howe?
Yeah, so as Matt says, straight after the takeover, the first few windows, Newcastle do spend aggressively, but because their revenue at that stage wasn't as high as it is now and it's still dwarfed by the bigger clubs, with the financial restrictions that are there within football, basically Newcastle then had to sell and didn't sell well. So instead they had the really fraught end to June 2024 when basically everyone just about was for sale. Anthony Gordon floated to Liverpool. In the end, Elliot Anderson and Yankuba Minter leave. But even since then, for a few windows, Newcastle were very restricted in what they could do. They didn't materially improve the first 11. They, for a good 5 windows, because they were still restricted PSR-wise, because you had the lag of over 3 years. It was a 3-year rolling period. And the wage pressure Newcastle had as well, because they were trying to pay higher wages, but still couldn't really afford to do that. And then last summer, they did have what at the minute has looked like a fairly disastrous window, certainly not just beyond Isak. Yes, they got £125 million, a British record transfer fee for Isak, but they could have had 110, 115 million for him 4 or 5 weeks before. Instead, they didn't engage with Liverpool and basically torpedoed their own window in the process. They overspent on the players they did sign, some of whom haven't worked out, and they're going to have a financial cost of that moving forward. So undoubtedly, the financial restrictions that are there have affected Newcastle. They have an ageing squad in so many ways. The business they didn't do last summer was almost as damaging as the business they did do, because they've just had players who clearly, in the course of the last few weeks and months, haven't been able to deliver what they did previously. They're ageing, or players are thinking about their own futures. The Isak situation was damaging beyond just what it meant for Newcastle's striker situation. You've had other players looking at it. And what Isak really symbolised was when Newcastle were able to sign the like of Sandro Tonali and Anthony Gordon early on, was they were presented with this idea of, we're going to have a new stadium, we're going to have a new training ground, we're going to be this club, we're going to be challenging for all these honours. And 3 years on, the infrastructure projects haven't yet materialised, haven't been announced yet, and Newcastle have had to sell their best player last summer. It's unclear if and when they will actually challenge at the very top of the Premier League. And so it does feel at the moment like this entire project, for want of a better term, is at a critical juncture. If Newcastle are going to kick on again, it's almost like 2.0 of it. This is where Newcastle need to rebuild. They need a side which is going to progress and build, but it's probably going to be a younger side. They can't afford to go out and spend ready-made players. They're going to be signing younger players, which means that it probably will be a bit more of a transitional year or two moving forward. And so it does feel like for Eddie Howe, it's a difficult job to sort of turn that around from where they were before. He's built it once, he's going to have to build it again if he stays. And does he have the energy to do that? Does he have the tactical ideas to be able to mould a new side? Are the players who are going to remain, do they still want to hear from him? Do they need a new voice? All of these questions are sort of hanging over Newcastle right now, particularly given the fact that their on-field form is chronic. It's not just that they've lost the last couple of games. Basically, in 2026 so far, they've regressed massively. But even during the first half of the season in the league, they were picking up results, but their performances were just not there to match it.
Yeah, I do think if you're an investor, Matt, you've got these big ideas. I hope they did anyway. The fans have big ideas, and then you're hit with these restrictions. So actually, those ideas don't ever really see full fruition, or at least they're curbed for the time being. Is that what we're seeing reflected on the field as well? That actually Newcastle haven't been able to go all guns blazing and catch up with all those other teams they want to be part of?
I don't know. Look, I know this is the narrative around the club, right? I totally understand that, and Chris has talked about the signings they made, the signings they haven't made. I'm looking at the people they've bought. They've bought young players. Livramento, Howe, Woltemade. They've bought plenty of young players. Yeah, they've bought some older players too. There's been a bit of a mix, so it's been hard maybe to sort of discern an overriding strategy at times. But they've bought a range of players, a range of ages. Look, if we just address this idea that they've been massively hamstrung by PSR, yeah, no doubt in 24 they were. They got themselves into a PSR bind. But I go back to one of the things that was supposed to be really attractive about Newcastle back in 21. That was that they had PSR headroom. That was, it was sort of like another string in the bow. Why PIF would be interested in Newcastle as opposed to any of the other clubs that are almost permanently for sale. And that was that Ashley had been running a really tight ship, so you've got a bit of a run of it here, and that's what they did. But they didn't sell that well, and PSR catches up with you in the end, unless you are massively pushing on the revenue front all the time, and that is on the pitch, so your prize money's good, European competitions, latter stages of European competitions, really being aggressive on commercial, and really boosting your match day. So this is where I guess what I'm, a long preamble. My problem with the narrative that PSR has is the story, right? And that Newcastle have been massively held back. Yes, but where has been the pushing as hard as you can commercially? They didn't take on the Premier League on associated party transactions. They very much played the kind of, we'll be good citizens, we'll let Man City do that. But they could have been more aggressive. They absolutely could have. Yes, there's been, I don't know, it's about £50 million worth, maybe a bit less of Saudi-related, PIF-related companies that have sponsored Newcastle. But they could have done more. They could have. I speak to lots of people in the game who think, oh, you know what? Newcastle have actually been pretty mellow on that front. We thought we were expecting a lot more of that. And I don't think the Premier League would have had a leg to stand on. Yeah, they might have, trimmed some of it and pushed back on a tiny bit of it. But there was definitely, there's a feeling in the industry that money's been left on the table there. And I think the other thing that's really, really big is the infrastructure stuff. They've spent about 30 odd million. I think most of that is on tarting up the existing training ground, which was a bit of a dump. I'm told, Chris, you go there. So they've gone to sort of kind of like, Premier League average. And the other projects, like the new site, doing something really interesting at the stadium, the existing one or a new one. There's been lots of talk, loads of talk. And then last, I suppose they did the fan zone thing, didn't they? Around, was it around Strawberry Place? Is that what it's called? The small stuff. This is what EFL clubs do. This is what my team, South United, do. This is not like sovereign wealth fund type behaviour. So I just feel for the narrative to stack up for me, I would expect to see this like full momentum, this chomping at the leash. We're being held back. Look what we're spending on the training ground. Look at our stadium plans. Look at our commercial department. Look at the tours we're doing. It's all been a bit okay. I'm not seeing this. We're challenging the red cartel or whatever it is, choose your bogeyman. We're challenging them everywhere, aggressively, every day. I'm just not seeing that.
Just to pick up on that, what's been interesting since David Hopkinson arrived as CEO in September, he's come up with this, well, it's basically Yasser Rahman, the chairman, the governor of PF, had previously said Newcastle, the idea is to be number one. He's given this sort of Vision 2030, piggybacking off Saudi Arabia's own Vision 2030, that Newcastle will be challenging by the end of the decade. And so he's been asked regularly about the fact of, are you being held back? Will the rules stop that? And his argument is, we can't push back against that until we do the things that Matt says. We haven't helped ourselves enough, so we haven't maximised commercially yet. They can have their first ever training ground sponsor for next year. Knox have come in, and Knox Hydration, so that's a commercial opportunity. He spoke just on Wednesday at an event in London talking about how Newcastle haven't got a car partner, they haven't got a partnership with an insurance company, and that all of these other areas, they need to help themselves. They need to sell better to bring in money in that regard. And so until they maximise all of those avenues, only then can you maybe turn around, if they're still being prevented and still can't get to the top, can you maybe turn around and say, it's the rules that are stopping us. His argument is, we haven't even maximised what we can be within those rules yet, never mind beyond.
Yeah, really interesting. Well, let's move on. Let's talk about last summer and Alexander Isak, who Newcastle obviously lost. And this summer, noise is already building up around players like Anthony Gordon. Chris, look, there are similar whispers around Sandro Tonali. Is there a fear that Newcastle could have a massive summer exodus this coming summer transfer window?
Well, I think there is among some fans, and I think given that media reports continue to ramp up around several players, that's understandable. I do think big players will leave this summer, possibly in the multiple there. I don't think all of them will go, and I also think that Newcastle are going into it with a far better mindset than they did last summer, when the idea was, they were adamant from the very top that Alexander Isak was not going anywhere, and they ended up with the worst of all worlds because they held out until the very last. And yes, they got a club record fee, but as I said earlier, they torpedoed their own window, and he did end up going, and so they buckled at the last, and that's the problem, that nobody now believes that they will hold firm on these sort of players. And what they would like to ideally do this summer is, with Anthony Gordon, it seems increasingly likely he probably will leave. I think partly because it's almost accepted on all sides, maybe his time at Newcastle has come to an end. The 2024 saga with Liverpool when he was briefly floated when Newcastle needed PSR issues. Basically, since then, it hasn't quite been the same for him. He was brilliant during the 2023-24 season, really struggled last season, has been better, certainly in the Champions League this year, but he's sort of flitted in and out, and maybe that just for both parties, it's better for him to go. And Newcastle think they could get a decent amount of money for him, meaning they can reinvest. So they're not, I don't think Newcastle's hierarchy are frightened of that now. I think that they're more, they almost want to change the perception that maybe there is a negative. There's this horrible hangover at Newcastle, which has been there since the 80s, really, when Gascoigne left and Beardsley left, that Newcastle sell their crown jewels, and that they've had this basically ever since, that it seems the big players leave. Johan Cabaye 10, 12 years ago, similar sort of situation, and that actually we do need to trade inwards and outwards, and sometimes that means that you have to sell one of your best players because you can make a substantial profit on them, and because it's maybe better for all parties to do that. They want to be more sober, I suppose, about this. And so that's a long answer for me to say, yes, I do think some of these players will leave. I don't think it will be all of them. I think it'll be significant ins and outs, volume-wise, double figures easily combined, because there are so many players that Newcastle need to sort of move on. There's got a lot of players who are out of contract. Kieran Trippier is already leaving. Fabian Schär will probably follow at the end of his contract. And so they're going to have to replace some of these players. But I think it'll almost be a sort of one in, one out. So I think Gordon probably goes. Tonali, I'd say I'm 50-50 at this stage. There's people I think in Newcastle who think he will go. I'm still not sure if anyone will meet the financial requirements it will take to extract him. But because Newcastle have him tied down till 2030, essentially. Tino Livramendo's had injury problems, heavily linked away, but I think those injury problems may prevent him from going right now, and I think Bruno Guimaraes will stay. So of those big players, maybe 2 will go, the rest I think will stay, and then Newcastle rebuild around them. So I don't think it'll be an exodus, but I do think Newcastle's squad will look significantly different come the start of next season.
I'm also reminded of a pod we did only last week, where we were talking about Leicester. For 5, 6, 7 years ago, Leicester were the disruptors. They were the ones who had their noses pressed up against the window going, do you know what? We're the next. If there's a big 6, we're number 7. Maybe we can pick Spurs off. Maybe we can get into that Champions League group. What was it? Back-to-back 5th places. They went, obviously they famously won the title, won the FA Cup. They went to a Champions League quarter-final. They went to a Europa League semi-final. It was starting to believe, right? Big time money. And then, of course, we saw, they kind of grasping for it and they didn't quite get it. And then they've fallen away. They make some bad decisions. And I think we were talking that one of the key decisions that they got wrong was they'd stopped selling the big player every year. That was very much part of the business model. We'll be honest with where we are in the pecking order. We're going to have to sell one of our good players every summer. And they didn't do it, crucially, and they messed up. Now, I don't think Newcastle are quite as vulnerable. I mean, first of all, they do have PIF behind them. I think also Newcastle have been just a bit more conservative. They're not running as hot as Leicester were, in terms of wage turnover ratio. So I'm not saying that Newcastle are vulnerable, but Newcastle are having a bad year, right? They're having a quantifiably, objectively bad year. So if we were doing this in a year's time, it might be, what did Newcastle do with the warning that Leicester ignored? So I think that's interesting. Chris is the man for who they're going to sell. I think they've got to sell someone. And I completely agree that they messed up the Isak situation. And really it was in terms of the time they gave themselves to replace him.
I actually agree with what Newcastle have done, because they have avoided the Leicester situation, as Matt said, of having high wages to turnover. But the problem is, until their turnover is significantly more, they can't match the wages that the players. So if Liverpool do come in for Alexander Isak, beyond the cachet of moving to Liverpool and then being defending champions at the time, is he can basically double his wages going there. And it's the same with a lot of other players. And Newcastle have that problem that they have tried to keep the wage structure fairly tight. It has expanded post Mike Ashley, but it's still not the equivalent of most of the so-called big 6 clubs. And until their revenue is at a place where it can be, they can't sustain that. So that's part of the problem as well. And that's why they will have to continue to sell players over the course of the next few years, because when a player reaches elite status or believes there should be elite status, then they're going to want to go and get that elite wage structure, which Newcastle haven't got yet.
Ahead of recording, we put a poll out on YouTube actually asking who would be the biggest loss for Newcastle United heading into next season. Anthony Gordon, Eddie Howe or Sandro Tonali. 62% voted for Tonali. How do you feel about that?
That's an interesting response. I mean, I suppose we're going to always question were they only Newcastle fans who responded as well, but it doesn't surprise me. I don't think that Gordon would be bottom of that, despite, I mean, he got 10 Champions League goals this year. He's got 17 in all competitions, but in the Premier League, he hasn't hit the heights as Newcastle haven't. He's really performed on the big nights, but the fact he can play winger come striker means he is difficult to replace in that sense, but I also think that a lot of Newcastle fans would argue that he hasn't consistently offered enough. Sandro Tonali is the player who Newcastle think profile-wise will be most difficult to replace and probably won't be able to replace like for like, because he is, if not unique, very difficult profile to have someone similar to what he can actually offer exactly to what he brings for Newcastle, his engine, his ability on the ball and the like. Eddie Howe, I think that the 25% voted for Howe shows that there's a split at the moment, and I think it is there is a split among the fan base. Some who, although I think almost universally everyone reluctantly would see the back of Howe if he was to go because of what he has brought to the club, but there's some who I think are now set in their ways that he cannot take Newcastle any further forward. There's others who are far more sympathetic to the situation there's been, to the difficulties there's been over the last couple of years, executive churn, PSR issues, the fact he hasn't been able to refresh the squad. And I do think that we're seeing at the moment that split play out in the stands, that at Newcastle's home matches, whereas for a good few years post takeover under Howe, it was everyone was united, everyone was together. Now it isn't that there's sort of all out booing, but it just feels like, certainly against Bournemouth, Newcastle's last home game which they lost, they're 1-0 down. There was a chance which Bournemouth should have had to go 2-0 down, and it felt at that point, the reaction of the crowd, if Bournemouth had scored again, it did feel like the crowd, or at least a significant portion, were maybe there ready to turn, and that'll be fascinating to see when Newcastle host Brighton on Saturday. If they got to struggle, do the crowd stay, or do the majority of the crowd stay with Howe? Because I think there are increasing question marks about, does he have the ideas and the energy and the wherewithal to turn this around, or has this just reached maybe a natural conclusion after what had been 4 magnificent years?
Yeah, that poll was interesting, Matt, because Eddie Howe for me has been really instrumental to what this modern day Newcastle represent. And you think about the jubilation and the joy of winning a cup in so many years, and also, you know, even with Isak, and obviously he's had to oversee a lot. I think he'll be such a loss to Newcastle because much of this club now is in his DNA.
Well, dear, you're asking me to comment on football matters, which you know I have opinions on football, but I am normally reluctant because they are sort of things to be shared over a pint. Look, Chris has the front row seat there. What I will say, I went to both their Carabao Cup finals, and I thought the first time they somewhat froze and didn't sort of give off their best, right? They didn't look like Newcastle. They didn't look like the Newcastle I've been watching on TV. The second time, they absolutely destroyed Liverpool, and that was sort of peak Eddie Howe Newcastle. What I've seen of them this season, they just were hit and miss, right? They had some good moments pre-Christmas, and it's been more missed, hasn't it? That's the thing. I mean, there've been injuries, of course. You know, some of the new signings just haven't worked, and inevitably, it's any club. You would start to sort of think, well, you know, is he still getting a tune out of them? Is it time for something else? And I do wonder, and I've got nothing against the guy at all. I'm just sort of thinking, if Newcastle United were going to be this insurgent, shake things up, you know, like kind of that Man City thing, even PSG, would it be Eddie Howe they chose? Eddie Howe is a good guy. Would we have moved on from Eddie Howe by now? I have a horrible feeling that we would, if they were being that aggressive. And then we'd be having a conversation about how unfair that was to Eddie Howe. I think Eddie Howe is sort of, he's there, right? That if he doesn't feel that conversation, he should, because I do wonder if he is slightly run out of steam. I don't know. Okay.
Well, if we're talking hit or miss, Out goes Isak, in comes Woltemade and Johan Wissa. Chris, this week you've reported that there's a possibility of offloading Wissa. It's a real shame because he had such a great few seasons at Brentford, I should say. But I thought he was supposed to be that sort of Premier League ready sort of signing that just kind of helped Newcastle push on.
Well, he was supposed to be, but at the same time, he also wasn't the player who necessarily Newcastle wanted, and both the players are basically byproducts of the mess of last summer, as we said, of the Isak situation. Newcastle left it too late. They actually wanted a striker before Isak was leaving because Callum Wilson had left on a free transfer. They'd tried for several players over the course of the summer, Liam Delap, Hugo Ekitike, João Pedro. If they had come in sooner, then maybe the situation wouldn't have unfolded as they did. Benjamin Šeško was slightly different. At that point, Newcastle were exploring, could they sign Šeško and then let Isak go to Liverpool? That didn't happen either. And Woltemade was a very different profile to what they had before. He scored goals when he first came in, scored each of his first 6 shots on target, but stylistically, clearly very different, and Newcastle didn't evolve around him. He didn't manage to accommodate himself fully and hasn't been in the team. Johan Wissa signs on deadline day. Newcastle initially bid 25 million for him early in the summer, ended up paying 55 million pounds because Brentford basically said take it or leave it. He, like Isak, had a situation where he hadn't trained with the team throughout the entire summer to try and push through the move. How much that's affected him is up for debate, but he also, before he'd even kicked a ball in training for Newcastle, went away with DR Congo, got a serious knee injury, probably came back slightly too soon, actually scores 3 goals across 3 competitions early on, but basically has barely been seen as a starter since, hasn't reached the levels. And yeah, Newcastle are exploring the possibility of whether they could move him on, because they do want at least one striker ahead of next season, and that probably means that one of Woltemade or Wissa goes, for a significant loss for either, certainly for Wissa. But it's just, it felt wrong from the start, despite what he could bring as a sort of proven Premier League player. Wissa wasn't the player that really went all out for all of last summer. They made bids early on, but he was never actually really top of even going into the last 2 weeks of the window, they were trying to get Jorgen Strand-Larsen from Wolves, and would have happily, I think, paid 10 million more than they paid for Wissa to get Strand-Larsen if they could have done. They were more sold on him than Wissa, and it just has not worked out yet. It's a shame for everyone, because the idea was he was meant to take some of the pressure off Woltemade as well. With the injury, Woltemade had to play a lot. And yeah, that's really the story of Newcastle's season. The story of Newcastle's season, as basic as it is they can't put the ball in the back of the net at one end, and they've made far too many errors at the other end, and that's what's combined to have them where they are on the table.
Yeah. Newcastle finished 5th last season, currently 14th in the Premier League. Let's see how it all ends up. Gents, appreciate your time. Matt, Chris, and also thank you guys for joining us as well. We'll catch you soon. For more from the Athletic FC podcast, make sure you like and subscribe to the channel. We've got top journalists like David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anker, and plenty more through the entire season. Make sure you don't miss an episode of the Athletic FC. You can get it wherever you get your podcasts from.